Now, one of the biggest pains it can be for producers or composers is actually keeping things interesting while keeping them minimal when working with ambient elements. So what I have here is I've loaded up 3 of my own songs, works in progress and completed ones, just to give an example of some of the ways that I keep things minimal but keep it interesting, and some of the effects processes and ways you can introduce elements and vary your melodies, things like that. So this is going to be kind of interesting since I'm going to be critiquing my own work. But I'll just start without further ado playing the first one. So the first thing I did with this is I used a filter with my drums filtering in. So we're introducing a drum loop. I also added some vinyl noise to this drum loop, so it makes it a little bit more atmospheric, if you will. So first element, obviously done some reverb and processing to this. So just adding slight variations like that at the end of 4 bars or so can add a little bit more interesting to your listeners. But just gradually introducing the elements also helps stretch out the length of your track a little bit, depending on how long you want it to be. So introduce a pad, once again with some verb on it and everything kind of meshing together with my mix down. So it's just gradually incrementing on top of each other and introducing elements and layers to your song. So introduce some bass, once again slowly introducing the elements. New element to it. So the new element takes the forefront of this because the background is still looping and doing the same thing. Now once again it's looping a little bit, but if I recall I added some variations to it. This is another trick, switching to a sound that is a little bit different than the one you were using, but slightly different, doing the same melody or something like that. Often it can be a transition that listeners don't notice quite as much as a producer would. Introducing another element later on. Once again, just adding layers and layers. So we're creating a sonic soundscape here, and honestly I could pull out the drums and the bass on this and it would be probably more of a completely ambient track than it would be laid back like downbeat. Now here I'm using some panning tricks on it. This is extreme panning, but I was using some panning and stuff before. This is another way you can keep things mixed up a little bit. Using panning is one of the best tools in your arsenal. Especially for headphone listeners. Let me see. There's not that much longer left to it. Maybe a minute or so, I believe. So we've kept the same beat and everything through the whole thing. Another thing you could do is do some variations in your beat if you're using drums. And obviously some of your background layers, people are kind of subconscious about them now. they've heard it's been looping for so long, you're probably not thinking about the background layers as much anymore. So if you add some slight variations into that, that will actually keep people's interests without them even noticing it. And something I didn't really use in this track is incidentals. Incidentals like stabs or something like that, or maybe random risers every so often in the background. I kind of did more persistent with this, so... This one plays more on melody and not completely always looping the same thing. There's always some element that's changing a bit. Now, a lot of this track actually came down to using, say, pitch bend, portamento, and actually me playing the keyboard along with it. So this was, I believe I did this over multiple takes. It was a while ago that I wrote this. And what I've already started doing here is pulling back some of the layers that I've already added in, just easing it back out so we have an outro. So drop some of the layers that you had before, gradually fade them out, stuff like that. Keeps the track going, but it also makes it more new, because you're seeing some of the other elements added more to the forefront. And once again, strip it back. This is kind of standard fare for doing an outro for me sometimes. Just strip everything back to the way it was at the intro, and gradually fade it out. So it's kind of similar to a roller coaster, I'd say, for a lot of the ways that I write ambient type tunes and stuff like that. I just start with a gradual peak in, gets to the top, maybe do some loops, stuff like that in the middle, and then it slowly comes to an end and rolls out. And yeah, that's enough of that song. I think you have the idea of how the fade out's going. So the next one is another good example, which is why I picked it. Go to the beginning. This is basically just the same thing looping over and over at the beginning, and gradually fading into effects and other things. You'll see as it's playing. Now this, funnily enough, is actually a really processed Commodore 64 sound. So by using automation at this, as it gradually comes in, I automated my effects on this. So I'm automating my wet and dry level on a reverb right here. And there's a bit of delay added to it as well. Now as the delay and the reverb start lapsing each other a little bit, you get a little bit of a feedback loop, but not so much that it becomes a problem. So we're adding more frequency content, as you can see.
Before I came here, I was taking LSD, marijuana, every type of dope.
Add in a simple loop like that.
Me the right way. I would not be in college right now.
This is something else I like doing. I like taking a different sound and adding in an element, playing the same melody or something like that as the backing melody, but they're still playing off each other. And this time I'm switching up the main melody, the one that's more in the forefront, but the background's still playing the original melody. So they're playing off each other, which is another really good trick. I think that kind of shows some of my affinity towards analog and tape, and I think I used wow and flutter and stuff on that as well. I actually have all the original sounds going from unprocessed to how they processed, which I might dig up and show at the very end of this. So we'll go to my final example. I was actually using this one earlier. So this is just kind of layering samples on top of each other. Like I said before, we have the storm sample, the walking, doorway, and the dripping sounds. So this is kind of how you can take field recordings and other samples that you get. I believe I got these all from freesound.org, if I recall correctly. So combining the actual sounds in the intro with that, along with these pads, we're creating a mood. This also comes down to a little bit of music theory as well, which you might want to take a gander into sometime. Personally, I'm not really big on it. I just kind of play things, and if it works, it works. I do know some music theory, but I don't put as much stock into it as a lot of people do. I just kind of go by ear. So once again, we're using some samples and stuff like that for rhythmic to accompany our actual main rhythm of this track, and also creating kind of the tempo early on. And I'm actually using the dripping sounds to create a melody as well. So as they fade into each other, it allows the transition from our pads to our main percussion and everything like that a little bit easier. Now once again, I'm using some of the effects on this with the actual pad in the background and everything. Using some automation on that and the effects that are on it. Which you'll notice throughout the actual track, I do some variations on the melody and so we have the bass element going on now. Basically we have the main track that's going on. This doesn't really evolve that much further over this. Besides just doing some variations, which is, like I said, a good trick. And this is actually a 9-minute long song, so I'm not going to play the whole thing, but I'm going to go to some more of the variation parts. So we're doing some variations in the melody with our pads, and also the bass line. More variations and also some panning at the same time. And also we reintroduced the footstep element, so we've got some more added to the rhythm. Swishing it up a little bit, back to the same little melody that we had before. Still all using the same pad sounds, a little bit of variations done to them and stuff like that. And now we introduce back in the dripping sound. And we'll skip ahead. Okay, so now we switched up the tempo with actually by switching the bass line. Didn't switch up the tempo, we switched up the beat to it a little bit. Once again, switching up the melodies on different elements. Go back to our transition part, kind of going back to the way we had it set up in the intro. So yeah, let's take a look at this part actually. This is actually a nice little transition piece. So we're going to fade out. If I recall, I faded out the pads for the most part. So we're kind of repeating our intro again, but also doing a slight variation on it. and then back into the main part. This time while maintaining everything that we added in before from the intro and not just cutting it out immediately. So slight variation again. Same techniques pretty much going on throughout it, changing up the drum pattern a bit. Like I said, I'm not going to put you through the whole thing since it's over 9 minutes if I recall. Once again, fading stuff out, adding some effects. Final fade out, and yes. So that's just some of the ways that I add, keep things minimal while keeping them interesting. Now some of the other techniques, obviously you can switch chords and stuff like that with your melodies. If you're playing in a major chord, you can go down to a minor chord. Diminished fifths, things like that. You can use some more music theory. And like I said, one of the other really good techniques is using a sound that is similar to your main melody. Say you want to keep playing the same melody, just slightly change up that sound, or switch it to, say if you're using a triangle wave as the base of your sound, or a saw wave, switch it to a square wave, and see how that goes. Just slight variations like that, for even if it's, say, 1 bar out of 4, or 1 bar in 16, can keep people's interest peaked. The other thing is using incidentals and stabs and stuff like that, like risers in the background. You can have the same melody going, and then just add a riser, say after 8 or 16 bars, something like that. Depends on how formulaic you want to be about it. But another good exercise is just sitting back, doing what I just did with my own songs, but do it with songs that you want to emulate. Like, I do this all the time. I'll sit there and I'll pick out elements and how they're layering on top of each other with some of my favorite producers. Take some notes about it, and then try and recreate it myself, and that's one of the best ways of learning. So hopefully this got you a little bit more stronger on your composition. Now, I just did some quick digging and found the files on my computer. So just to give an example of that second song that I was playing, how the actual processing went along. This is the raw sound for the main melody. This is going to give you a good idea of how processing can actually go. So next what I did is I added an expander, because this was coming directly from an old Commodore 64, which at the time I hadn't modded out some of the line noise that comes from it, so I added an expander to get rid of some of the line noise. Then I added some saturation. Then a Moog filter. Some reverb. Unstable, which is a detuner plugin. So this is kind of similar to the Wow and Flutter one, but it does a little bit of a different thing. And then I actually added Wow and Flutter. Then some more tube. And we have it finally in the tune.
Without our past supervisor to teach me the right way, I would not be in college right now.
So hopefully that gives you a brief idea of how just your effects channels and everything like that can affect your whole sound design, and introducing and messing with the effects levels and automating them in your song can make it a whole world of difference.